Welcome, everybody. I am John Fowler, the co-founder of International Intrigue, as it says on my little bio there. With me today, and you'll meet her in just a second, is Kristen Talman. She's our Washington editor. She's actually dialing into us from Oman, such as she's a global jet setter, but she is based in Washington normally. Firstly, thank you all so much for signing up. We've had over 500 folks sign up for this webinar to join us today. Pre-submitted dozens and dozens of questions. We couldn't be more excited to bring this to you. It's actually the first time we've hosted a live virtual event, so we're just thrilled. Quick word for anybody who's joining us who doesn't know us or know what we do. International Intrigue is a daily global news briefing. It's written by former diplomats, myself, my co-founder Helen Jung, and our managing editor Jeremy Dicker, who's based in Australia, all former diplomats. And we cover global politics, foreign affairs, national security, things like that. Now, the goal of Intrigue is to bring you these kinds of topics in a concise, engaging, dare I say it, entertaining way, because these issues are so important. And a lot of what's out there covering these issues is, very technical, very academic, very jargon-filled. I remember, Helen, when we were founding International Intrigue, we shared that if we couldn't make it through an edition of The Economist, then we were sure as hell that most people couldn't either. So we wanted to try and solve that problem. So it's with that mission that we're talking to you today. And I will also just note before we start that International Intrigue is apolitical. We don't take sides. We're analysts. We want to figure out what's really going on rather than have emotional or kind of discussions where we've already arrived at a conclusion. Now, the man at the center of today's discussion, former president, now president-elect Donald Trump, is a man who it's difficult to stay neutral about. Some of you tuning in will love him. Some of you will absolutely hate him. But I'm pretty sure almost none of you will feel apathy or neutral towards him. You'll have a view. So I want to just say that the conversation today will take an approach of like trying to get at the truth. We're not going to have an emotional conversation. And hopefully there'll be stuff that you disagree with here today. And certainly that you haven't heard before. That's really our goal. We don't take sides. The goal here is to have you walk away from this conversation knowing something you didn't, or having heard something you hadn't heard before, which will make you better at your job. Or most importantly, a better dinner party guest. And given that the holiday season is fast approaching, you'll be very grateful to have something interesting to say that is deeper than just the weather. Okay, with that said, let's get stuck in. Kristen is on stage, virtual stage, I guess, here with me. She's going to spend a couple of minutes recapping the election. So she does a lot of our Washington-based work. And actually more important than just the election, because I'd wager again that most of you know what happened. But there's been a lot of developments in the last week, particularly some key personnel announcements for the Trump 2.0 administration, as we're calling it. So she's going to give you a quick crash course in that. And then I'm going to come back and with Kristen, we're going to set the scene for the foreign policy discussion, because this discussion will focus on foreign policy rather than domestic policy. I'm so excited for this, folks. I'm really glad that you could join us. Kristen, why don't you kick us off with what happened last week and what happened since?
Yeah, and I guess we can throw up a map that gives sort of a visual too. Just the quickest recap, as many of you probably know, in terms of there are in the House of Representatives, there's 215 Republicans thus far, 205 Democrats. There's still some seats to be determined. In the Senate, 52 Republicans, 47 Democrats. Republicans have won control of the Senate, and the margin still remains in the air as some races will determine how narrow the margin of control is. The Republican base, so Trump team won the Electoral College with 312 Electoral College votes and over 75 million votes in the popular vote. Winning the popular vote for the first time the Republicans have in over a decade. And so, yeah, it was not as close as the polls showed, but now that's basically all old news, right? Because it's a week ago, and that's just how quickly things are moving in Washington. It's quite an exciting time to read the news and watch the news and be in Washington and talk to people and get coffee and all those things, because everyone has their own different theories and ideas, and then there's sources and contacts who might have a better idea than others as they jet down to Mar-a-Lago. Just today, House Speaker Mike Johnson said that the Republicans are ready to deliver on President-elect Trump's statements and what he pledged during his campaign. Trump is going to meet with Johnson at the Capitol on Wednesday. He's going to be in town for a visit to the White House. And Johnson also said that he'll be spending the weekend in Mar-a-Lago this weekend in Florida as they prepare for the second term. A lot of names has been thrown around. Most recently, that seems to be catching a lot of speed and excitement, is that Marco Rubio is looking poised to be the Secretary of State. That has not yet been confirmed. You have to wait for the Truth Social post, the tweet, etc., to know if, but some of the big outlets are reporting with quite good sourcing that he looks to be the Secretary of State, which both of our guests will really talk to at length of how some of these new cabinet shakeups will prepare and shape the Trump 2.0 policy. Some other names that have been thrown around, it looks like Mike Waltz, which is very similar to Tim Waltz, but it's like, oh wow, we still have a Waltz there. I know, yeah, right. But he, a Republican, is selected to be the National Security Advisor. It looks like Kristen will take the head of Homeland Security, and there are some names that are not coming back. Mike Pompeo, Nikki Haley, who initially ran against Trump in the primaries, they will not be joining the Trump administration thus far. Things are always subject to change. You never know what can happen. Elise Stefanik is now going to be the U.S. ambassador to the UN. That's a big get for her. She's been an ardent defender of Trump during his impeachment. She's been a very staunch backer of the Trump campaign and really made her name to fame in a hearing last year when she was talking to university heads of universities who then were subsequently ousted from their roles. So that's really where her claim to fame comes from. And as John always likes to say, personnel is policy. So a lot of the next few weeks will be deep diving into different hearings that all the names mentioned have been in, what their policies are, where they wrote in The Economist a month ago, things like that. Every last word will be dissected, both from all the political strategists who are rapid fire tweeting right now, and from capitals around the world who will keep that in backdoor notes.
Yeah, Kristen, thanks for that. I think also it's important just to note why the Senate control and the potential House control the Republicans will have matters for foreign policy. And essentially, it just means that Trump has already said his nominees for key positions in his administration. And I read somewhere that there's over 4,000 political appointees in any administration. So there's a lot of appointees, but he's going to back the person to lead the Senate who most will kind of conform with his views, i.e. rush his appointees through. So that's, for our purposes, that's ambassadors, that's key advisors, and these kinds of things. So he's going to be able to, in a way that he wasn't in his first administration, he's going to really be able to shape his personnel around him. And I expect him not to have anybody, like the Rex Tillersons or the John Kellys around him that maybe disagree with his positions. Okay, so let's step back a bit and set the scene for the discussion that we're going to have with our two experts who we'll bring in a moment, and just kind of set the scene for the foreign policy part of this. So I think it's fair to say that Trump was elected on an isolationist policy. He's deeply skeptical of foreign engagements, wars. He's skeptical of NATO, as we all know. And I think more generally just skeptical of multilateral organizations and security arrangements, right? America first, it's kind of in the name, but there's a bit of context on that. And that's that America really, for most of its history, certainly from its founding right through to kind of World War II, that was the American foreign policy DNA, right? I've got a note here, in his farewell address of 1796, President George Washington called for as little political connection as possible with foreign nations. It is our true policy to steer clear of permanent alliances with any portion of the foreign world. So folks love to talk about the founding fathers. There is the founding father saying we basically don't want to be involved with the rest of the world. So in a way, you can understand Trump's instincts from that perspective. Now, I think a lot of today's conversation will focus on what Trump is going to do in his second term. I mean, that's why we're all here trying to figure out the unknown. But I think the only thing we definitely know for sure is that it's going to be unpredictable, not just because Donald Trump himself is a fairly unpredictable decision maker, but because, foreign policy conforms to what I call the first law of Mike Tyson's universe, which is everyone has a plan until they get punched in the mouth. So it is for presidents when they're acting on the world stage. They may have grand designs on getting things done, and then something happens over here or blows up over there, or Russia invades Ukraine or COVID or anything like that. Which actually is what's happened since Trump was president the first time. When we try and figure out what he's going to do in his second term, it's very natural to turn to what he did in his first term. But let's not forget, he left office in January 2021. Since then, we've had the full playing out of COVID and the after effects of that, economic, social, things that we don't even know yet. We've had Russia invade Ukraine in February of 2022. And we've obviously had Hamas's attack and Israel's response since October last year. So it's hard for me to think of a kind of a gap, a 4-year gap that's been more consequential in foreign policy and global geopolitical developments than the last 4 years. So Trump's facing a very, very different world to the one that he had in 2016. And we might put up a poll for folks who are watching us to just see whether you think he's going to be able to influence the world in the way he did in his first term. And Kristen, I think I'd be interested in your views on this. The reality is that despite promising a lot of solutions, he's very good at kind of identifying problems and promising solutions. A lot of his promises and his proposed solutions rely on the rest of the world. You can take, for example, the southern border and immigration, which is, you may be tempted to think of that as a domestic American issue, but he's presumably, if he's going to deport a lot of illegal immigrants, he's going to need to work with Central American countries to get that done. So what he does on the world stage really does matter. And I think his isolationist policies, the old adage that foreign policy doesn't win you any votes, that may be true, but he is going to need to engage with the world to get the rest of his agenda done. So this stuff really, I think, does matter. And again, I said at the top, Trump is a man who everyone will have a view on, and he does things unconventionally. So the conversation we're going to have today and that we're having is a little bit of a stab in the dark. We can kind of put some boundaries about what we think is likely, but we don't know. I mean, Kristen, we were reading this morning that Elon Musk was on a second introductory call today. He was on a call between Trump and the Serbian president, Alexander Vučić. He already joined a call with Trump and Zelensky earlier this week. I can only imagine in my former career as a diplomat that ambassadors and diplomats everywhere in the US Foreign Service are just freaking out at what a break of protocol that is already. And he's not been, he's not the president, and he's only won an election a week ago. So things will be, they won't be boring. Let's put it that way. Okay, so, and we've just got the results in for this poll. Let me just read those out very quickly. Most of you, 54% of you, think that he'll need to adjust to new regional dynamics. So that kind of means that he's not going to be able to just pick up where he left off with his China policy, his Iran policy, his general policies. And the next biggest response was uncertain, because personnel is policy, and we don't have a full picture of that yet. Okay, we're going to focus on two of the more known challenges today. So there's a ton we don't know, but we can be fairly safe in saying that President's inbox, Trump, when he sits down at the Resolute desk at 1 p.m. or whatever it is on January 20, he's going to be dealing with the Middle East. That's kind of the 5-alarm fire right now. And he's going to be dealing with China. And I think that's fair to say. So we were going to include the Russia-Ukraine war in this one, Kristen, but he's promised, I think, to solve that day one. So no real need to discuss it, right? It's going to be finished.
Right.
But more seriously, I think top of the inbox will be Iran and the Middle East. Israel, every morning, every day, I wake up to news of new strikes on Lebanon or Gaza. The balance of power in the Middle East has changed dramatically since October 7 last year. Trump isn't too keen to get involved in conflict as a rule, but he's been a very, very strong supporter of Israel traditionally, and rhetorically on the campaign trail. At the same time, he's a friend of Saudi Arabia. His internal advisors, Jared Kushner, have great relationships with MBS and the Saudi regime. So that's going to provide some interesting conflict, because the Saudis just yesterday in Riyadh reiterated their call for Israel to end its, and I'm quoting here, genocide perpetrated by Israel against the Palestinian people. So those two things are a potential, he's going to have to manage that, being pro-Israel, but also, working closely with the Saudis. The way I look at that is that we're a long way away from the Abraham Accords, which is the kind of deal that President Trump struck in his first term, aimed at kind of getting Israel to be recognized in the Arab world in return for some American concessions. And that's before we get to the question of Iran and how it's changed. Its proxies, Hezbollah, Hamas, and perhaps to a lesser extent, the Houthis in Yemen, have been degraded significantly in the last year. And I think perhaps it's fair to say that Iran is in a vulnerable position right now. But we're very, very lucky, Kristen, to be joined by someone Ali Vaez, who is the director of the Iran Project and a senior advisor to the president of Crisis Group. He played a key role in facilitating the 2015 nuclear agreement between Iran and the P5+1. He's seriously a seasoned expert on Iranian affairs, and his work has regularly featured in the New York Times and the Atlantic and CNN and BBC, places like that. So, that is we're going to have an incredible conversation there. But before we bring Ali in, I want to just quickly set the stage for the China conversation we're going to have, because we've got another amazing expert to talk about China. And I think I think about this, Kristen, in a more long-term way. I don't know if that's a fair thing to say, but China it's not kind of the five-alarm fire right now, but it is, to me, the existential kind of challenge for America in maintaining its power and its influence around the world. I think under Xi Jinping, China's done a pretty good job of undermining the American-led world order. It's just chipped away at the edges of multilateralism. It's undermined confidence in the global kind of governance system, trying to roll back American power around the world. It's obviously getting closer to Russia. It's getting closer to Iran, Venezuela, these kinds of countries. And one misconception about China is it doesn't want to, blow the world order up and remake it. It wants to work within the current world order to shape it in its own interests. And that might be different from Iran, or different from Russia, or different from some of the other countries that are going to face Donald Trump in his second term. We're very, very lucky today to be joined by Neil Thomas. He's a dear friend of Intrigue and a genuine world expert on Xi Jinping and Chinese politics. So we're going to chat to him about how Xi Jinping is going to see a second Trump term. He's been writing a lot of these things in, the Washington Post, Foreign Policy, New York Times, Bloomberg. So I'm kind of overwhelmed by how lucky we are, Kristen, to be joined by Ali and Neil. So Ali, welcome. I'm not sure if Neil's with us yet. He's on a train to New York this morning, but he will be with us soon. But Kristen, why don't you kick off things with a question to Ali, bring him into the conversation?
Yeah, first of all, Ali, thanks so much. You're probably one of the hardest people on Iran's book, just because you're in such high demand with such expertise. I'm curious, just yesterday, right, we saw the Saudi Crown Prince, MBS, as he goes by short, or maybe just the world calls him, seem to be calling on the world to oblige Israel to not strike back against Iran. What can we read between this warming of relations between Iran and Saudi Arabia? That's kind of the million-dollar question these days.
Well, Kristen, thank you very much for having me. It's very nice to meet you, John, and I'm really thrilled to be on the show. I've been a fan of it for a long time, so it's an absolute pleasure to be here today. Look, the question you're asking is a fascinating one, because I do believe it's one of the most impressive diplomatic feats of the past few years, Iran-Saudi détente. I wouldn't really call it rapprochement, but it's they normalized relations in 2023. And the Saudis have managed to basically deter Iran just by being nice with Iran. They haven't really paid any significant price or made any significant concessions to the Iranians on the security side or on the economic side. The Iranians expected the Saudis with very deep pockets to make investments in Iran. They haven't done that. And yet, they have managed, the Saudis, the Emiratis, other GCC countries, they have managed just by opening channels of communication to the Iranians and being civil and nice in relations to them to get themselves out of the line of fire, completely shield themselves off from tensions in the region, and basically focus on their number one priorities, which is economic prosperity and development based on a roadmap and milestones that they have devised for themselves. It is truly impressive. And Iranians have an interest in playing into this game because they have very serious security concerns coming from their western borders, whether that's Israel flying over Syria and Iraq and bombing Iran, whether that's U.S. presence and so on. That's where they're focused. They don't want to open a new front in the south. They don't want to do anything that would further push the Saudis and the Emiratis towards Israel. So for now, the Iranians are also satisfied with the status quo of having better relations with the Saudis and the Emiratis, despite the fact that, again, they're not really getting much out of it. This is a situation that I think is sustainable in the short run. In the medium to long run, probably not. But for now, everybody's happy with it. And one of the reasons that we got to this point is that the Saudis and the Emiratis got what they wanted in the summer of 2019 when the Trump administration, in its first iteration, managed very successfully to impose maximum pressure sanctions on Iran and cut off Iranian oil exports to China almost to below 100,000 barrels, down from upwards of 1 million barrels a day. But that backfired on the Saudis and the Emiratis. The first Iranian reaction was to target the port of Fujairah in the UAE. Then they started targeting tankers and ships in the Strait of Hormuz. Then there was a spectacular attack on Saudi Aramco oil facilities in September of 2019 that took off half of Saudi oil exports overnight. And the Saudis realized that this kind of zero-sum game with Iran, even if it's done through proxy, if the U.S. is the one that imposes this kind of pressure on Iran, will turn them into collateral damage. And they cannot count on the U.S. to keep them out of the line of fire. Again, they found a much better way of doing it. And I believe this situation will continue for a while. So if the Trump administration is coming back in, thinking that the Saudis and Emiratis would be as much of cheerleaders of putting pressure back on Iran, that's not going to be the case.
Yeah, it's so interesting is it feels like on day one, January 20th, Trump he can't just, expect Saudi Arabia to roll over and recognize Israel. That's not going to happen. Right, he's not stepping back into a 2020 presidency, and but there's a lot of anger towards Iran. And there's been assassination attempts on Trump that have been blamed on Iran. What do you think Trump will look to do on day one, and how do you think Tehran is preparing for whatever his first step is?
So first of all, it's anyone's guess with President Trump, of course. But there's literally bad blood between Iran and Trump. Of course, President Trump killed General Soleimani in Baghdad in January 2020. And ever since then, the Iranians have wanted to kill him and people around him. Just this week, the Department of Justice has issued indictments for people who were involved in plots against President Trump. And we know, like Brian Hook, who was his former special envoy for Iran, is now overseeing the transition at the State Department. And there will be a lot of other officials in this administration who have personal reasons to be hawkish on Iran. I think President Trump himself is, driven by the allure of doing a deal with Iran. That's what he wanted in the first term. He tried multiple times to meet with the Iranian president. And I think this concept of outwitting the very cunning Iranians at the negotiating table is extremely attractive to him as the ultimate testament of his mastery of the art of the deal. So he likes it. The problem is almost no one in his entourage shares that objective. And in that sense, you have a duality between the president himself and his administration. Now, the lowest common denominator between the two is in the utility of pressure as the main pillar of the policy. Now, I think, again, President Trump sees pressure as means towards the end of getting a deal with Iran. Probably almost everyone around him sees pressure as an end in and of itself to get regime change or regime destabilization. But very likely, I think everybody would agree in that administration that President Biden has weakened America's hand at the negotiating table because of lack of enforcement of existing U.S. sanctions. So what I anticipate is from day one, a return to maximum pressure, maybe even ultimate pressure this time, and pushing the Europeans to snap back the UN sanctions against Iran. And basically putting pressure on China to curb Iranian oil imports. All of that, of course, is very difficult when you're also simultaneously imposing tariffs on China. That makes China less risk averse in relations with the U.S. It will put pressure on energy markets when you're also, as a result of tariffs, putting pressure on commodity goods and so on. So there are lots of contradictions in these policies that we don't know how they're going to manage. But I think it's not far-fetched to imagine that there will be a return to pressure policy. Now, Iranians never respond positively to pressure. They will try to match that pressure by creating their own leverage. So I anticipate ratcheting up their nuclear program, ratcheting up their activities in the region, support for their partners and proxies, maybe targeting even U.S. interest in the region, U.S. forces in Iraq and Syria, and so on. And also maybe potentially withdrawing from the non-proliferation treaty as North Korea did in 2003, and we all know how that story ended. So in many ways, I think that approach is going to put us on a trajectory towards a military confrontation rather on a trajectory towards the bargaining table.
Yeah, it's fascinating because this dichotomy you speak to, right? You have this one hand, maybe there's this, this yearning to make a deal, but if you can't really quite do that if you've ratcheted up pressure and then you essentially just there's no negotiating table. I'm curious, you touched on the nuclear policy, and I want to just focus on that for a second. I think Grossi, the head of the IAEA, is going to Iran this week, if I'm not mistaken. I mean, in terms of what does the U.S. want to see from nuclear policy? And it's quite fascinating to see how much of a diplomat Grossi has become, talking to different powers that now other diplomats, Western diplomats, don't really have the same access to that he does.
Yeah, absolutely. He's positioning himself well to run for Secretary General of the UN next time around, and I'm sure he has that ambition. But the reality is that what he's trying to do now is to prevent the situation from completely getting off the rails. In the sense that IAEA has two sorts of problems with Iran. One is about the past of Iran's nuclear program. The Iranians have done some tests when they had a nuclear weapons program pre-2003, and the IAEA has found some traces of nuclear material that are unaccounted for. So that's about the past, but they're also worried about the future. In the past 3 years, Iran has produced a lot of advanced centrifuges, and the IAEA doesn't know where they are. that increases the risk of Iran having clandestine facilities in which it can basically dash towards a nuclear weapon. And if these problems are not resolved, eventually this file would have to be referred once again to the Security Council and becomes once again a non-proliferation crisis at the international level. So C is going there to try to buy time, try to figure out some degree of justification, not to end up in a full confrontation with Iran over the issues about the past and about the future. The problem he has is that he can't really make a lot of progress as long as the broader political problem about the nuclear standoff between Iran and the West, Iran and the US, remains unresolved. And again, I don't see the prospect of a quick resolution because I feel like things will have to get worse before they could even potentially get better or even get worse. But the first phase doesn't look like a quick breakthrough is on the books. And so I'm not very hopeful that his mission would be super successful. I'm happy he's doing it, but and the alternative is worse, but I have very tempered expectations.
Yeah. Okay, let me hand over to John.
Yeah, I want to bring Neil in. Firstly, Neil, thanks so much for joining us. I know you've got a busy day and you're running between trains and taxis and all of that kind of stuff. And before you joined, I called you a world expert on Xi Jinping, so no pressure there. My first kind of question to you is, we went through some of the announcements that Donald Trump's already made about who's going to fill Secretary of State, National Security Advisor, and that kind of stuff. So personnel's policy, presumably Xi Jinping is quaking in his boots in Beijing at this China Hawk 2.0 kind of administration. But what do you make of the message that Trump is trying to send potentially to China, and what do you think Xi and his closest advisors will think in the week since he got elected to now about how US-China relationship's going to develop?
Thanks, John, and thanks International Intrigue for having me. It's a great big series of questions that you've just asked. So I think for me, the two big signals are that Trump is in charge, right? He's promoted loyalists who have been at the forefront of backing his second term, rather than some figures from his previous administration, like say Mike Pompeo or Nikki Haley, who are backing him, but have broken with some of his positions in the past, especially on Ukraine and Russia policy. So it's a more disciplined and focused administration, and that's important for the type of deal making that Ali talked about in relation to not just the Middle East, but also potentially with China and Xi Jinping down the track. The other message that Trump's trying to send, I think, is that really economic policy is at the heart of his foreign policy. I mean, there's one thing that he's been consistent on for the last 4 decades or so of his public life, if not longer, is tariffs, trade deficits, trying to bring back manufacturing and production to the United States, trying to reduce that deficit. And he's kind of seized on tariffs as being the magic weapon for trying to do that. And he doesn't call himself tariff man without reason. I think that's the one thing I'd be willing to quite comfortably put a lot of money on for the priority for China policy once he gets into office in January. Whether we actually see the promised 60% tariffs across the board on Chinese imports is another question. It's certainly possible that we see a few very prominent items being subject to those types of tariffs, and a lot of business lobbying getting down the rate that's placed on other goods coming in from China. We know that type of approach is what characterized trade policy in the first Trump administration. So it's likely to play out again in a similar form this time round. So I think the message is that to Beijing is we're going to hit you where we think it hurts, which is the economy. And I think that's that line of analysis has a lot of truth to it. I think China does care about the economy. Xi Jinping does care about China's economy more than perhaps some people appreciate, even in Washington, D.C. And we've seen a kind of step back in some of the assertiveness, some of the wolf warrior rhetoric over the last couple of years as China's economy was hit by zero COVID and has kind of struggled to get out of that funk ever since. So I think that this is a series of appointments that's probably on the the worst end of expectations from China's point of view.
Yeah, it's interesting too, because I mean, I think a lot of folks would be aware that China's economy is in a bit of trouble right now. I mean, they're kind of, I think it's probably number one priority in Beijing is to figure out how to fix their economy, and then you have their most important relationship looking like they're going to turn up the heat on the economic side of things. So my sense, and you've written about this recently, I think, is that Xi Jinping will try to exploit Trump's self-professed love of a deal, right? Like Donald Trump projects himself as a guy who can bring all these different things together and create a grand bargain that makes everyone happy. Do you think that's a fair assessment of how Trump will approach the China relationship? And if it is, what would a deal that maybe gives away tariffs to China, releases tariffs in China, helps China's economy kind of not get hit as hard, what would America be looking for in return, and what might that look like? And the obvious specter here is Taiwan, because I've read a lot that people are worried that Trump will bargain away Taiwan in return for something else.
That's certainly a prominent worry in DC, but I think it's really hard to predict the contours of any type of grand strategic bargain. And I think Trump will be sensitive to some degree to the concerns that almost everyone he appoints will have about not selling out Taiwan. It's a pretty firm focus of a lot of leading Trump-affiliated Republican foreign policy thinkers. And there's a whole school of thought about we actually need to reduce our commitments in Europe and in the Middle East precisely so we can focus more military, diplomatic, economic resources on Taiwan and deterring any potential Chinese invasion in the future. So I think that will be a theme of the administration. As to how much Trump wants to balance that with making some kind of deal, I don't think it'll get to the point where that's really on the table. We're just going to give up on Taiwan. And I think we already have seen Taiwanese politicians make some moves to signal they're going to try and have big purchase orders of American weapons. So that's something that Trump will like. That's good for the economy. It's good for American business, good for American manufacturing as well. So the authorities in Taiwan are aware of the potential for having downside risk here, and they're trying to move very early and very hard to make sure that's not the dominant frame of view of the Trump administration's analysis of the problem. So I think that when it comes to the big strategic bargain that maybe Trump wants to do, or at least a US-China trade agreement, phase 2 trade agreement to build on the phase 1 that happened in his first administration, I think the tariffs and the domestic manufacturing focus, that's something that it'd be hard for Trump to walk back from. It's quite a central part of his whole, not just China policy, but really foreign policy. So potentially if we saw China promising to buy huge amounts of American manufactured goods, of American agricultural, other commodities, maybe there's some moderation of the tariffs, but I can't really see a scenario where they are completely removed or even significantly reduced while Trump's in office.
Yeah, I think I agree with you. I had read somewhere that he might force, BYD and other big Chinese kind of EV manufacturers to open plants in Ohio and all the politically sensitive places in America, but we shall see. Before we open up to questions, because we've got a ton of them that folks want to ask you both, an area of overlap between your expertise might be the BRICS, and whether you think that's going to be more important, less important in Trump's 2.0 presidency. Obviously, it's kind of, in my view, a bit of a nothing burger to date. It's kind of a lot of sound and not much more. But I don't know. Let's start maybe with Ali. Do you see Iran's role in the BRICS kind of as a consequential new development, or just again this kind of this idea that there's this alternative to the Western order, and not much more than that, other than just signaling?
Yeah, I think I agree with you, John, that in general, it has potential, but it's not a short-term phenomenon in the sense that, there are two things that Iranians need in any alliance. One is assurance that their economy can survive and thrive without getting sanctions relief from the West. And this is something that, they've tried in the past few years, especially with China. all China is doing is buying discounted oil from Iran, which is important, but in return selling low-quality Chinese goods to the Iranians without giving them a lot of choice, in an arrangement that some Iranians begrudgingly call oil for junk. And then, you know, they can't even repatriate the hard currency to the extent that they need. The Russians, militarily, they have a much closer relationship with Iran now than was the case a few years ago. And yet they're not giving Iran what it really needs: the S-400 missile defense systems, the Su-35 fighter jets. These are things that would make the next Israeli attack on Iranian territory much more difficult. But Russia is not delivering. So this kind of alliance is far from something that the Iranians can put all of their eggs in this basket. And again, there's also a long historic list of precedent for the Russians stabbing them in the back or in the front, you know, by basically selling them to the highest bidder, whether it's the US or anybody else. And they wouldn't rule out that in one of the quid pro quos that you were talking about in the case of China, one could also see that the Iran card might be something else that the Trump administration might call for.
Neil, what do you think about BRICS generally from China's perspective?
Thanks, John. I think I agree with you that up until this point, BRICS has mostly been a symbolic grouping that reflects the desire of, you know, leading global south or developing or emerging nations to, you know, have a bigger say in international affairs. I think, though, you know, there has been a push, especially from China, to operationalize some parts of the BRICS grouping, obviously to bring in new members. That's been something that China's pushed with some success over the last couple of years, with several Gulf nations and others joining, and that's likely to continue. There's dozens of expressions of interest. So, to the extent, what extent can the BRICS actually, you know, achieve some kind of mechanism for development financing, for you know, currency swaps outside of the US dollar? That's going to be a big watch point, and especially as you know, if Trump does follow through on some of his promises to withdraw from various parts of the global governance system that they don't view as beneficial. There's already been some noises in that direction. Does Trump withdraw from the WTO, for example, or take some of those more extreme measures? We might see a kind of pickup of coordination within the BRICS to try and kind of solve this kind of deficit in global governance that would be presented from the United States withdrawing. But it's a big question. So I think BRICS for me is less of a, you know, alternate international order at the moment, and more of a watch point for the, you know, kind of collective opinion of, you know, these emerging economies.
Yeah.
Kristen.
Okay, so we asked a poll, which was, where should the U.S. focus for its efforts for a more stable region? And it looks like 60% of people said strengthening partnerships to address regional security threats. So aligning more with allies, I guess, and then go after what's needed. All right, I'm going to ask a question from the chat from Dr. Harry Zamakwe that aligns with both of you as well. So maybe we'll do the same method because it's so interesting to hear both of your thoughts. What did China get out of negotiating the detente between Iran and Saudi Arabia? Yeah, what did they get out of it, and will they be looking to get more out of it in that same sort of strategy? Maybe we'll start with you, Ali, again.
Prestige, honestly, but not much more than that. In fact, the Chinese were pushing against an open door, and you know, already the Iraqis had facilitated several rounds of negotiations, high-level political negotiations between Iran and Saudi Arabia. And then the Omanis had facilitated technical negotiations about the text of that agreement between 2021 and 2023. So the Chinese really came right at the end and took credit for this, but all the heavy lifting was done by the Iraqis and the Omanis. And the reason the Saudis wanted the Chinese to be involved was that they wanted somebody with leverage over Iran to be involved so that they could keep Iran's foot to fire if they don't comply. But, at the end of the day, China has demonstrated that it is not willing to do anything that would punish Iran or Saudi Arabia for not delivering on their promises. They also had the ambition to build on it, and they were supposed to have a GCC Iran Leaders Summit by the end of 2023. That didn't happen, of course, because of October 7th, and it even didn't happen afterwards in 2024. In Doha, in Qatar, there was a meeting for the first time between Iranian foreign minister and the GCC foreign ministers, historic meeting for the first time in 45 years, without China's involvement back in October of this year. I think it was just a question of prestige, that China can play a significant role in diplomacy, but without a lot of infrastructure beneath it, and without necessarily a plan to try to build on it.
I would just add really quickly that I think Ali's on the money. China wants to have its cake and eat it too. It wants to be seen as a global leader. It wants to be seen to be playing an important role in stabilizing and shaping the direction of important conflicts and issues around the world. But it's also hasn't been willing to put its own interest on the line and to bear the potential costs of playing a really involved role in these negotiations. So it's still a watch this space type of issue for China. Is it actually going to take on the type of role that the United States has previously played in the Middle East, in Russia, Ukraine potentially? And right now it doesn't look particularly likely. They haven't really put their own interests on the line to a significant degree yet.
Okay, I'm just looking through the Q&A here. There's some fantastic questions coming in. One about the Ukraine situation. We're not going to give that any time today. I think there's been enough demand that we might actually host a separate session with a Ukraine-Russia expert in the near future. So keep a lookout for that. But I want to ask you a question, Neil. I think this is one right up your alley. It comes from RJ Pandy. He says, I've heard conflicting reports of whether or not Xi Jinping has competent people around him advising him. How should we think about Xi's top-level advisory staff? And I would just add to that, how does that work? Is it similar to a Western system, or does China's kind of top-level decision-making happen in a very different way?
It happens in a much more opaque way. We really don't know very much about the how of policy in China. We see the outputs, we see what China does, we can see the inputs in terms of the real world data of what's happening, but the black box really is how does that all come together? Who is leading decision making? Who likes who else? Who hates who else? That's stuff we really we can't read that in the New York Times like we can for either the Biden or the Trump administrations. So there is a big question mark on that. But in terms of the major recent shift in how elite politics looks in Beijing, that I think is relevant for decision making, before the 20th Party Congress, a 5-yearly leadership turnover, which happened in October 2022, Xi Jinping had a number of legacy people in his inner circle, allies of former leaders, his predecessors, who had moved through the system while Xi was still in the process of consolidating his own power. But after that party congress in late 2022, Xi really put the full stop on that process of consolidation and was able to install a new leadership lineup that was 100% packed with people that had worked under him early in his career or trusted advisors. So kind of a maximum Xi scenario is how I described it at the time. And that has some potential downsides, which is this just going to be a group of yes men? That was one of the theories out there. But really, I think the more likely case is that Xi now feels more comfortable with the people in that inner circle, the people at these top level meetings, and perhaps is actually a little bit more willing to listen to negative feedback about what's happening in the world, willing to consider ideas from these subordinates who couldn't be seen as representing potential rival power bases in the party. And that's potentially one of the explanatory factors behind the recent moderation of China's diplomacy and economic policy since that kind of final year of COVID, when we had wolf warrior diplomacy, we had crackdowns on various private sectors. Things aren't necessarily great now, but there's certainly a moderation that's happened in the last couple of years.
Yeah, that's I completely agree with you on that. Kristen, do you want to read these poll results we've just had on the US-China relations and then ask another question?
Okay, so what should be the US approach to balancing its complex relationship with China? Okay, 40%, these aren't no figures super high, but 40% say increasing alliances in Asia to counter China's influence. But there's the other two are pretty much tied at 28 and 29, which is prioritizing diplomatic engagement to ease tensions and focusing on US economic growth over competition with China. It seems like there's some diverging opinions on what exactly Trump should do. Maybe you should fly down to Mar-a-Lago and tell him yourself.
Okay, we've probably got time for a couple more questions. Kristen, why don't you pick one that you find interesting, and then I'll go with one after that, and then we might wrap up to get people to their lunch breaks on time.
Yeah, I mean, I had pulled out a few that's, but something I'm quite interested in that someone else had brought up, which was, what relationships do you both think Iran and China will be leaning on to counterbalance some of Trump's first moves? Who should we see them organizing, diplomatic visits with?